Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and we are back with more Greek mythology. Today we'll be continuing the adventures of Aeneas. He'll be descending into the lower world, which is what part 2 says, the descent into the lower world. Anyway, let's jump into this. The journey from Carthage to the west coast of Italy was easy as compared with what had gone before. A great loss, however, was the death of the trusty pilot, Palinurus, who was drowned as they neared the end of their perils by sea. Aeneas had been told by the prophet Helenus, as soon as he reached the Italian land, to seek the cave of Sibyl of Cumae, a woman of deep wisdom who could foretell the future and would advise him what to do. He found her, and she told him she would guide him to the underworld, where he would learn all he needed to know from his father Anchises, who had died just before the great storm. She warned him, however, that it was no light undertaking. Trojan, Anchises' son, the descent of Avernus is easy. All night long, all day long, the doors of dark Hades stand open. But to retrace the path, to come up to the sweet air of heaven, that is labor indeed. Nevertheless, if he was determined, she would go with him. First, he must find in the forest a golden bough growing on a tree, which he must break off and take with him. Only with this in his hand would he be admitted to Hades. He started at once to look for it, accompanied by the ever faithful Achaides. They went almost hopelessly into the great wilderness of trees, where it seemed impossible to find anything. But suddenly they caught light of two doves, the birds of Venus. The men followed as they flew slowly on until they were close to Lake Avernus, a dark, foul-smelling sheet of water where the Sibyl had told Aeneas was the cavern from which the road led down to the underworld. Here the doves soared up to a tree through whose foliage came a bright yellow gleam. It was the golden bough. Aeneas plucked it joyfully and took it to the Sibyl. Then together prophetess and heroes started on their journey. Other heroes had taken it before Aeneas, and not found it especially terrifying. The crowding ghosts had, to be sure, finally frightened Ulysses, but Theseus, Hercules, Orpheus, Pollux had apparently encountered no great difficulty on the way. Indeed, the timid Psyche had gone there all alone to get the beauty charm for Venus from Proserpine, and had seen nothing worse than the three-headed dog Cerberus, who had been easily mollified by a bit of cake. But the Roman hero found horrors piled upon horrors. The way the Sibyl thought is necessary to start was calculated to frighten any but the boldest. At dead of night, in front of the dark cavern on the bank of the somber lake, she slaughtered 4 coal-black bullocks to Hecate, the dread goddess of night. As she placed the sacrificial parts upon a blazing altar, the earth rumbled and quaked beneath their feet, and from afar dogs howled through the darkness. With a cry to Aeneas, "Now you will need all your courage," she rushed into the cave, and undaunted he followed her. They found themselves soon on a road wrapped in shadows which yet permitted them to see frightful forms on either side, pale disease and avenging care, and hunger that persuades to crime, and so on, a great company of terrors. Death-dealing war was there, and mad discord with snaky blood-stained hair, and many another curse to mortals. They passed unmolested through them, and finally reached a place where the old man was rowing a boat over a stretch of water. There they saw a pitiful sight, spirits on the shore innumerable as the leaves which fall in the forest at the first cold of winter, all stretching out their hands and praying the ferryman to carry them across to the farther bank. But the gloomy old man made his own choice among them. Some he admitted to his skiff, others he pushed away. As Aeneas stared in wonder, the Sibyl told him that they had reached the junction of 2 great rivers of the underworld, the Cocytus, named of lamentation loud, and the Acheron. The ferryman was Charon, and those he would not admit to his boat were the unfortunates who had not been duly buried. They were doomed to wander aimlessly for 100 years with never a place to rest in. Charon was inclined to refuse Aeneas and his guide when they came down to the boat. He bade them halt and told them he did not ferry the living, only the dead. At sight of the golden bow, however, he yielded and took him across. The dog Cerberus was there on the other bank to dispute the way, but they followed Psyche's example. The Sibyl too had some cake for him, and he gave them no trouble. As they went on, they came to the solemn place in which Minos, Europa's son, the inflexible judge of the dead, was passing the final sentence on the souls before him. They hastened away from the inexorable presence and found themselves in the fields of mourning, where the unhappy lovers dwelt, who had been driven to their misery to kill themselves. In the sorrowful but lovely spot, shaded with groves of myrtle, Aeneas caught sight of Dido. He wept as he greeted her. "Was I the cause of your death?" he asked her. "I swear I left you against my will." She neither looked at him nor answered him. A piece of marble could not have seemed less moved. He himself, however, was a good deal shaken, and he continued to shed tears for some time after he lost sight of her. At last they reached a spot where the road divided. From the left branch came horrid sounds, groans and savage blows, and the clanking of chains. Aeneas halted in terror. The Sibyl, however, bade him have no fear, but fastened boldly the golden bow on the wall that faced the crossroads. The regions to the left, she said, were ruled over by stern Rhadamanthus, also a son of Europa, who punished the wicked for their misdeeds. But the road to the right led to the Elysian fields, where Aeneas would find his father. There, when they arrived, everything was delightful. Soft green meadows, lovely groves, a delicious, life-giving air, sunlight that glowed softly purple, an abode of peace and blessedness. Here dwelt the great and the good dead, heroes, poets, priests, and all who had made men remember them by helping others. Among them Aeneas soon came upon Anchises, who greeted him with incredulous joy. Father and son alike shed happy tears at this strange meeting between the dead and the dying and the living, whose love had been strong enough to bring him down to the world of death. They had much, of course, to say to each other. Anchises led Aeneas to Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, of which the souls on their way to live again in the world above must all drink. A draught of long oblivion, Anchises said, and he showed his son those who were to be their descendants, his own, and Aeneas's, now waiting by the river for their time to drink and lose the memory of what in former lives they had done and suffered. A magnificent company they were, the future Romans, the masters of the world. One by one, Anchises pointed them out and told of the deeds they would do which men would never through all time forget. Finally, he gave his son instructions how he would best establish his home in Italy, and how he could avoid or endure all the hardships that lay before him. Then they took leave of each other, but calmly knowing that they were parting only for a time. Aeneas and the Sibyl made their way back to the earth, and Aeneas returned to his ships. Next day the Trojans sailed up the coast of Italy looking for their promised home. Part 3. The War in Italy. Terrible trials awaited the little band of adventurers. Juno was again the cause of their trouble. She made the most powerful peoples of the country, the Latins and the Rutulians, fiercely opposed to the Trojans settling there. If it had not been for her, matters would have done well. The aged Latinus, the great-grandson of Saturn, and the king of the city of Latium, had been warned by the spirit of his father, Faunus, not to marry his daughter, Lavinia, his only child, to a man of the country, but to a stranger who was soon to arrive. From that union would be born a race destined to hold the entire world under their sway. Therefore, when an embassy arrived from Aeneas, asking for a narrow resting place upon the coast and the common liberty of air and water, Latinus received them with great goodwill. He felt convinced that Aeneas was the son-in-law Faunus had predicted, and he said as much to the envoys. They would never lack a friend while he lived, he told them. To Aeneas he sent this message, that he had a daughter forbidden by heaven to wed with any except a foreigner, and that he believed the Trojan chief was this man of destiny. And here Juno stepped in. She summoned Alecto, one of the Furies from Hades, and bade her loose bitter war over the land. She obeyed gladly. First she inflamed the heart of Queen Amata, wife of Latinus, to oppose violently a marriage between her daughter and Aeneas. Then she flew to the king of the Rutulians, Turnus, who up to now had been the most favored among the many suitors for Lavinia's hand. Her visit to arouse him against the Trojans was hardly necessary. The idea of anyone except himself marrying Lavinia was enough to drive Turnus to frenzy. As soon as he heard of the Trojan embassy to the king, he started with his army to march to Latium and prevent by force any treaty between the Latins and the strangers. Alecto's third effort was cleverly devised. There was a pet stag belonging to a Latin farmer, a beautiful creature so tame that it would run free by day, but at night fall always come to the well-known door. The farmer's daughter tended to it with loving care. She would comb its coat and wreathe its horns with garlands. All the farmers far and near knew it and protected it. Anyone, even of their own number, who had harmed it would have been severely punished. But for a foreigner to dare such a deed was to enrage the whole countryside. And that is what Aeneas's young son did under the guiding hand of Alecto. Ascanius was out hunting, and he and his hounds were directed by the Fury to where the stag was lying in the forest. He shot at it and wounded it mortally, but it succeeded in reaching its home and its mistress before it died. Alecto took care that the news should spread quickly, and fighting started at once, and the furious farmers bent upon killing Ascanius and the Trojans defending him. This news reached Latium just after Turnus had arrived. The fact that his people were already in arms, and still more ominous fact that the Rutulian army had encamped before his gates, were too much for King Latinus. His furious queen, too, undoubtedly played a part in his final decision. He shut himself up in his palace and let matters go as they would. If Lavinia was to be won, Aeneas could not count on any help from his future father-in-law. There was a custom in the city that when war was determined upon, the two folding gates of the temple of the god Janus, always kept closed in time of peace, should be unbarred by the king while trumpets blared and warriors shouted. But Latinus, locked in his palace, was not available for the sacred rite. As the citizens hesitated as to what to do, Juno herself swept down from heaven, smote with her own hand the bars, and flung wide the doors. Joy filled the city, joy in the battle array, the shining armor and spirited chargers and proud standards, joy at facing a war to the death. A formidable army, Latins and Rutulians together, were now opposed to the little band of Trojans. Their leader, Turnus, was a brave and skilled warrior. Another able ally was Mazzinius, an excellent soldier, but so cruel that his subjects, the great Etruscan people, had rebelled against him, and he had fled to Turnus. A third ally was a woman, the maiden Camilla, who had been reared by her father in a remote wilderness, and as a baby with a sling or a bow in her tiny hand had learned to bring down the swift flying crane or the wild swan herself, hardly less swift of foot than they of wing. She was mistress of all the ways of warfare, unexcelled with the javelin and the two-edged axe, as well as with the bow. Marriage she disdained. She loved the chase and the battle and her freedom. A band of warriors followed her, among them a number of maidens. In the perilous situation for the Trojans, Father Tiber, the god of the great river they were encamped near, visited Aeneas in a dream. He bade him go swiftly upstream to where Evander dwelt, a king of a poor little town which was destined to become in future ages the proudest of earth's cities, whence the towers of Rome would soar up to the skies. Here the river god promised Aeneas that he would get the help he needed. At dawn he started with a chosen few, and for the first time a boat filled with armed men floated on the Tiber. When they reached Evander's home, a warm welcome was given them by the king and his young son, Pallas. As they led their guests to the rude building which served as palace, they pointed out the sights, the great Tarpeian rock, near it a hill sacred to Jove, now rough with brambles, here where someday the golden glittering capital would rise. A meadow filled with lowing cattle, which would be the gathering place of the world, the Roman Forum. Once fauns and nymphs lived here, the king said, and a savage race of men. But Saturn came to the country, a homeless exile, fleeing from his son Jupiter. Everything then was changed. Men forsook their rude and lawless ways. He ruled with such justice and in such peace that ever since his reign has been called the Golden Age. But in later times, other customs prevailed. Peace and justice fled before the greed for gold and frenzy for war. Tyrants ruled the land until fate brought me here, an exile from Greece, from my dear home in Arcady. As the old man ended his story, they reached the simple hut where he lived, and there Aeneas spent the night on a couch of leaves with a bare skin to cover him. Next morning, awakened by the dawn and the call of birds, they all arose. The king went forth with 2 great dogs following him, his sole retinue and bodyguard. After they had broken their fast, he gave Aeneas the advice he had come to seek. Arcady, he had called his new country after his ode, was a feeble state, he said, and could do little to help the Trojans. But on the farther bank of the river lived the rich and powerful Etruscans, whose fugitive king Mazzinius was helping Turnus. This fact alone would make the nation choose Aeneas' side in the war. So intense was the hatred felt for their former ruler. He had shown himself a monster of cruelty. He delighted in inflicting suffering. He had devised a way of killing people more horrible than any other known to man. He would link dead and living together, coupling hand with hand, and face with face, and lead the slow poising of that sickening embrace to bring about a lingering death. All Etruria had finally risen against him, and he had succeeded in escaping. They were determined, however, to get him back and punish him as he deserved. Aeneas would find them willing and powerful allies. For himself, the old king said he would send Pallas, who was his only son, to enter the service of the war god under the Trojan hero's guidance, and with him a band of youths, the flower of the Arcadian chivalry. Also he gave each of his guests a gallant steed, to enable them to reach quickly the Etruscan army and enlist their help. Meantime, the Trojan camp, fortified only by earthworks and deprived of its leader and its best warriors, was hard pressed. Turnus attacked it in force. Throughout the first day, the Trojans defended themselves successfully, following the strict orders which Aeneas had at his departure had given them on no account to undertake an offensive. But they were greatly outnumbered. The prospect was dark unless they could get word to Aeneas what was happening. The question was whether this was possible with the Rutulians completely surrounding the fort. However, there were two men in that little band who scorned to weigh the chances of success or failure, to whom the extreme peril of the attempt was a reason for making it. These two resolved to try to pass through the enemy under the cover of night and reach Aeneas. Nisus and Euryalus were their names. The first a valiant and experienced soldier, the other one a stripling, but equally brave and full of generous ardor for heroic deeds. It was their habit to fight side by side. Wherever one was, whether on guard or in the field, the other would always be found. The idea of the great enterprise came first to Nisus as he looked over the ramparts at the enemy and observed how few and dim the lights were, and how deep a silence reigned as of men fast asleep. He told his plan to his friend, but with no thought of his going too. When the lad cried out that he would never be left behind, that he scorned life in comparison with death in so glorious an attempt, Nisus felt only grief and dismay. "Let me go alone," he begged. "If by chance something goes amiss, and in such a venture as this there are 1,000 chances, you will be here to ransom me or give me the rights of burial. Remember, too, that you are young. Life is all before you." "Idle words," Euryalus answered. "Let us start, and with no delay." Nisus saw the impossibility of persuading him and sorrowfully yielded. They found the Trojan leaders holding a council, and they put their plan before them. It was instantly accepted as the princes, with choked voices and falling tears, thanked them and promised them rich rewards. "I want only one," said Euryalus. "My mother is here in the camp. She would not stay behind with the other women. She would follow me. I am all she has. If I die, she will be my mother," Ascanius broke in. "She shall have a place of the mother I lost that last night in Troy. I swear it to you. And take this with you, my own sword. It will not fail you." And the two started through the trench and on to the enemy's camp. All around lay sleeping men. Nisus whispered, "I'm going to clear a path for us. Do you keep watch?" With that he killed man after man, so skillfully that not one uttered a sound as he died. Not a groan gave the alarm. Euryalus soon joined in the bloody work, and they reached the end of the camp they had cleared as it were a great highway through it, where only dead men were lying. They had been wrong, but they had been wrong to delay. Daylight was dawning. A troop of horses coming from Latium caught sight of the shining helmet of Euryalus and challenged him. When he pushed on through the trees without answering, they knew he was an enemy and they surrounded the wood. In their haste, the two friends got separated and Euryalus took the wrong path. Nisus, wild with anxiety, turned back to find him. Unseen himself, he saw him in the hands of the troopers. How could he rescue him? He was all alone, and it was hopeless, and yet he knew it was better to make the attempt and die than leave him. He fought them, one man against a whole company, and his flying spear struck down warrior after warrior, the leader not knowing from what quarter this deadly attack was coming. Turned upon Euryalus, shouting, "You shall pay for this!" Before his lifted sword could strike him, Nisus rushed forward. "Kill me! Me!" he cried. "The deed is all mine. He only followed me." But with the words still on his lips, the sword was thrust into the lad's breast. As he fell dying, Nisus cut down the man who had killed him, then pierced with many darts. He too fell dead beside his friend. The rest of the Trojans' adventurers were all on the battlefield. Aeneas came back with a large army of Etruscans in time to save the camp, and furious war raged. From then on, the story turns into little more than an account of men slaughtering each other. Battle follows battle, and they were all alike. Countless heroes are always slain. Rivers of blood drench the earth, and the brazen throats of trumpets blare. Arrows plenteous as hell fly from sharp springing bows. Hoofs of fiery steeds spurting gory dew trample on the dead. Long before the end, the horrors have ceased to horrify. All the Trojans' enemies are killed, of course. Camilla falls after giving a very good account of herself. The wicked Menxenius meets the fate he so richly deserves, but only after his brave young son is killed defending him. Many good allies die too, Evander's son Pallas among them. Finally, Turnus and Aeneas meet in single combat. By this time, Aeneas, who in the earlier part of the story seemed as human as Hector or Achilles, has changed into something strange and portentous. He is not a human being. Once he carried tenderly his old father out of burning Troy, and encouraged his little son to run beside him. When he came to Carthage, he felt what it meant to meet with compassion, to reach a place where there are tears for things. He was very human too when he strutted about Dido's palace in his fine clothes. But on the Latin battlefields, he is not a man, but a fearful prodigy. He is vast as Mount Athos, vast as Father Apennine himself when he shakes his mighty oaks and lifts his snow-topped peace to the sky. Like Aegean, who had 100 arms and 100 hands and flashed 5 through 50 months, or 50 mouths, thundering on 50 strong shields and drawing 50 sharp swords. Even so, Aeneas slakes his victorious fury the whole field over. When he faces Turnus in the last combat, there is no interest in the outcome. It is as futile for Turnus to fight Aeneas as it is to fight the lightning or an earthquake. Virgil's poem ends with Turnus's death. Aeneas, we are given to understand, married Lavinia and founded the Roman race, who Virgil said left to other nations such things as art and science, and ever remembered that they were destined to bring under their empire the peoples of earth, to impose the rule of submissive non-resistance, to spare the humbled and to crush the proud. But yeah, that ends that episode. And in the next episode, we will be going into the families of mythologies. The great families of mythology is what it's called. It's a part 5, putting us in chapter 17. But yeah, so we hear a lot about Aeneas as coming to Italy to be a founder of Rome and the Roman Empire, where most people, I'm sure, have heard of Remus and Romulus, raised by the wolf mother, and Romulus having killed Remus. As being the actual way Rome is founded. But yeah. But we'll be hearing about some other Greeks through the royal families. We've got the House of Atreus, the Royal House of Thebes, the House of Athens. Then we get some brief myths, which brings us to the mythology of the Norsemen. So it's where this book talks a bit about Norse mythology. And like I said, we did read the Prose Edda. And if you remember, it spoke of the Trojan War. So there is a connection that goes back and forth between. You can see so much derived from Greek mythology and the Trojan War. In some parts of the prose Edda, it's the Trojans flee. It's some of the Trojans who survived the Trojan War fleeing to form Norse mythology. But yeah. And then we get some family trees. The principal gods. So we find out how they kind of interconnect. Descendants of Prometheus. Remember, Prometheus is the man who brought fire to humans and was punished for it because he was a titan, and he's like, they should have the knowledge of fire. And Zeus didn't like him doing that. The House of Troy, the family of Helen of Troy, the royal house of Thebes, and the Atreidae, the house of Athens. So yeah, we'll be coming in. We're winding down the book. As you can see, we've read this, the top part there. So yeah, we've just got so much to go. 345. About 120 to 150 pages left, so. Depending on going over the families and everything, but we've gone over a number of the great myths and legends. Like I said, now we'll be getting into family members. And remember, like Hamilton has pointed out, these are often combinations of stories by different authors that she's put together, or pieces by a certain author that she thinks tells the tale better, because there are multiple tellings in Greek and Roman mythology. Like I pointed out earlier, the founding of Rome. There's Romulus and Remus, but hey, there's also Aeneas, who founds the Roman Empire. But yeah. It's been an interesting set of stories so far. We've come across some really interesting ones. But we'll end this episode there. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, let me finish this properly. As always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.